Ahoy? Okay, thank you. My name is Robin, and I am quite nervous. I'm nervous for several reasons. Firstly, this technology of microphones and so on is unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And my wife always tells me that I must speak loud. But with a microphone, sometimes that can be dangerously explosive. But I'm also nervous because I've spent 3 days in the Czech Republic, and I'm very conscious that there is a limit to how much I understand this world. So I'll be presenting ideas whose evolution I have seen and been part of. I hope some of this will be meaningful to you. I want to try and find how this works, how these ideas will work for you. And we spent several days trying to find even the right vocabulary, the right words to describe ubytovny, hostel, hotel, accommodation. All these words have a slightly different meaning in each different institutional, political, cultural context. So I'm conscious that some of the words I use may be misleading. So please do ask, please do challenge me if something seems obviously curious. The other reason to be nervous is that people expect me to be the expert on this subject. And I always try and say, actually, I'm not the expert. I talk to the people who are. I listen to what they tell me, and I phrase it as best I can, as a journalist would do. But all that I am trying to do is understand what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing from people who are working in this field. I did work myself for 20 years as a social worker, so it's not that I have no lived experience. But much of what I'm trying to describe here arises from a dialogue, from an ongoing, continuous dialogue with people who are developing the practice and developing the ideas, and the two go together. The main message I want to put over today is that these are evolving ideas, and still evolving. So I try to describe as best I can a picture which is changing, and I hope it will be helpful to explain some of these changes. So from Radek this morning, we have what the science tells us. So the question for me has always been, what can we use this new understanding of trauma, this understanding of genetics, this understanding of the complex relationship between humans and our environments? How do we use this in our work? What helps? What of this actually helps us in our day-to-day work, in encountering clients or in managing services? How do we apply this? And in particular, how do we merge these new understandings from science? How do we merge this with the experience of workers who have maybe sometimes had 10, 20, 30 years experience of working with people with complex, difficult lives? That experience from learning from the client, learning in the work, is just as important. There has to be a dialogue between the experience of the workers and what the science tells. Science informs us, but we then have to decide how we use it. Do you hear me okay? Yes? Yeah? Okay, good. So, A third reason, or is it four now, to be nervous, is how much to say, how to describe this. Keep it simple, keep it clear, is always good advice, yes? Keep it clear, keep it simple. But at the same time, we have to admit that applying these ideas in practice will be complex. And then when we are working with people with complex needs, that work is going to be complex. Applying this is not going to be simple. And that's why we have to think about how we will use this. And we have to, I would say, talk to each other about what ideas we find useful. And then we own those ideas and develop them. And that is how practice and ideas develop together. So I'm going to take maybe 5, at the most, I think 10 minutes, just to tell a few stories. My own story of how I came into this, because the evolving of my ideas tells you something of where the ideas came from. I had a colleague who works with the Homelessness National Agency in the UK, who couldn't be here to talk about how we are developing trauma-informed care in the UK in homelessness. But she's given me her slides. So I will present for maybe 10 minutes or so her slides. You'll see when they're different from mine. It's quite clear. So that will be my attempting to describe how we use trauma-informed care at a theory of practice level. Later in the afternoon, we have colleagues from Ireland who will talk about what they've actually done in particular services. So I'll begin with trauma-informed care. I'll then talk about this other way of understanding services, which we call a psychologically informed environment, and then look at the similarities, the differences between the two. To understand what those similarities are, to understand what the differences are, and then hopefully you can decide which of these ideas you find most useful, what works for you. You have a repertoire, you have options, choices to find what works. There's been a lot of talk about Housing First, and I understand this is quite an exciting new development here in Czech Republic, as in everywhere in Europe. I don't here talk much about how these ideas apply in Housing First, but if people are interested, we can talk more about that at the Q&A session, and certainly in the workshop tomorrow, I think we'll be looking at that in practice. I think the most interesting, the most valuable thing about trauma-informed care and about the idea of trauma and the understanding of trauma is not actually the details of the science. To me, the most important, the most valuable thing is that it changes the nature of the discussion. As soon as we start to recognize the prevalence, the amount of trauma there is in the population, and particularly in the population where we have concentrations of people with major problems, when we understand that, the central question we are dealing with changes. It changes from being, what's wrong with you? Why do you do, what's, to being, what happened to you? And that changes not just the way of thinking, but the relationship we have, the dialogue we have with the service user. To me, that is probably more important than the specific neuroscience and so on. So with that in mind, let me try and present. Oh no, I said I would tell a story. Okay, it's 1971. I have just finished a social science degree, and I have been studying sociology of deviance, criminology, mental illness. I'm really interested in all this. And a friend of mine disappears. we're coming up to our final examinations, and suddenly she's not there. And I hear that she's become depressed and anxious, and she's gone to the hospital. And so I go to visit her, and it's 2 weeks since she's been there, and she's been on 3 changes of medication already in that time, and she's completely confused and lost. And the hospital is 10 miles from the university, and I'm the only person that's been to visit her. And she's completely cut off from her friends, her world. And I'm studying the sociology of mental health. And this is happening to friends of mine. And that began my journey of becoming interested in how the practice in mental health has to learn and develop and change. And then I hear about a completely new way to run hospitals, psychiatric hospitals. Many of you, some of you will know the term a therapeutic community. It's the idea that the hospital has to be a place where every interaction is part of the therapy, and where the community of people living there are some of the most valuable resources for your own journey of recovery. It became quite a sophisticated way of working, and there are therapeutic community movements across all of the world. I went to live in Sweden and worked in a community there. I worked in Scotland. I got really interested in this. The institution has to change to adapt, to meet and to work with the strengths as well as the vulnerabilities of the patient, the client. I then became interested in different ways in which different institutions did this. There were so many arguments about what's the right way to do this, the proper way. And I thought that the differences were very important and very interesting. So I, in the end, studied to become a social worker. I do my dissertation on the varieties, not the proper way, but the varieties of ways of using these ideas. You can see how this is beginning to become my way of thinking. 10 years on, I'm working as a psychiatric social worker in a community mental health team in the centre of England, in Nottingham. And we have patients who are my patients, who are difficult. They are uncooperative. They are melodramatic. They sabotage every attempt to work with them. And the doctors and the nursing staff are saying, this person has a personality disorder. They are untreatable. We treat proper mental illness, and this is not mental illness. This is messed up lives. We can't deal with this. And my patients are discharged, sometimes in a hurry, and they go to the homelessness service. They're sent there from the hospital. And I arrive at the homelessness service, and this person who has been so impossible to work with on the ward, in the hospital environment, is sitting there chatting with their worker, having a cup of tea, relaxed, engaged in a completely different way in a different environment. And I'm thinking, I want to understand this. What is happening here? There is something happening in homelessness services that means that they are getting good at working with people that we are not good at working with. And of course, it's the people with the complex personality disorder lives. And so I start saying, we need to learn from the homelessness services about what they are. Now, I did later discover that we have in Nottingham very, very good homelessness services, very progressive, very creative, very motivated. It's not like that everywhere. Many of the homelessness services we have are still very institutional, very punitive, all about containment and rules that will say what you must not do, and then people are evicted. So it was luck that I saw some of the best. But I wanted to describe what they were doing, because what they were doing seemed to me to be so similar. to what I'd seen and worked in therapeutic communities 10, 15 years earlier. To me, this was part of the same adapting these ideas to work with this population who was so difficult to work with in the conventional psychiatric model. 10 years on, and because I talk like this, because I say these things, because I'm describing something that no one else is describing, I become an expert, and I'm working with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Housing in England to develop new housing policy to ensure that people with major mental health problems can be in safe, secure housing and in work. And I know that some of the people with the worst and poorest mental health are not in secondary mental health care. They're too chaotic. They can't engage. The services don't want to know because they have no treatments to work with this group. I know that there is another population we need to include in this program, which is the people who aren't in mental health care, but who have the worst mental health. And so with some colleagues, we write an extra part of a report that would go to the government as what the policy must be. And to describe what work is being done here, they ask me to find a word to describe this, because I'm the one that's shouting about it. And some discussion, the word I come up with is psychologically informed environment. And the point is partly that they're using a lot of psychology. It's actually ordinary human psychology, but it's not trauma and neuroscience, it's just emotional intelligence. But they're creating a whole environment. They're building that community approach within the hostel. This is the best of the places that I saw, remember. And for various different reasons, that report is published, and everybody says, there were 3 responses. One group said, at last somebody has described what we actually do. You've given us a language to describe what we do, to explain, and to help us do it better. Another group said, we think we're doing a little bit. We think that's what we're doing, but could you spell it out more to make sure that we do know we're going in the right direction? And a third group, the biggest group, said, yep, we know that's what we ought to be doing, and what we're doing is nothing like that. But straight away we can see that this is what our people need. This is what we should be doing. Tell us how. Okay. We hadn't expected that response. But myself, the same group of people, we wrote another paper to say, this is how you can help to develop a psychologically informed environment. And we spelt out 3 or 4 issues that we thought were important. And that began a whole long program of discussions and workshops and so on and so on and so on, talking with people about how these ideas came about. So that is my story. That is why 10 years later, I am now seen as the expert, not because I am the expert, but because I tried to find the words to describe it. And that's all that I have, I think, achieved. But if those words encourage people to look at their own service in a way that's constructive and that respects the work they are doing, I'm happy. So, psychologically informed environment. In 2010, we published this report. What we didn't know was that at the same time, almost exactly the same month, another paper would be written in the United States. And that paper talked about trauma-informed care. To be honest, I think if we'd read that paper first, we probably would have used that word. We probably would have said, oh, it's trauma-informed care. That's what they're doing. But we didn't. We invented our own word, and what we'll see is whether there are some strengths, perhaps, in having two ways to look upon things. So if you bear that in mind, I'm now going to give you the trauma-informed care slides as developed by the Homelessness Agency in London. So when they give this talk, they have to run through all the things that Radek just went through. I think rather than reciting this for you, Ondra and the team can send out copies of these slides to those who would like to read this in more detail. But essentially, trauma is the result of an experience which leaves someone feeling unsafe and helpless, overwhelmed. Their normal ability to cope is completely overwhelmed. That's the definition of psychological trauma. There are variations in individual responses, and it's worth looking at them in some detail. I won't talk about that in depth, but there is a big difference between being in a flood. A flood can be very traumatizing, but a flood is a natural phenomenon. It's not deliberate. It's not personal. You happen to be there. People can be traumatized by a flood, but it's very different from being traumatized by an attack from a person. That is personal in a different way, and the personal trauma, that has a different impact on how people feel about the stress, the trauma. I'm being told I must speak closer to the mic. Oh, even closer still. Which is better? Is this too close? Not too close. This is better. Did you hear any of the last 10 minutes? I'm sorry. My wife would love this moment. She always tells me I must speak louder. To me, it sounds so loud. So, the different age at which people experience trauma, how far their personalities have developed, how far their self-confidence, their sense of who they are, that will make a difference to how deep the trauma is experienced, how much life experience they have to respond differently. The length of the trauma is one of the most significant things. For a child, a few traumas can be upsetting, but the children are very resilient. It's when trauma is repeated again and again and again. That's when you have really serious psychological damage. One big difference is whether you are alone or in a group. A group solidarity is a really important, really valuable way to recover from a trauma. I know that there's been research on trauma counselling after in a war, say, and what people have often found that individual trauma counselling is not always helpful. Getting people to discuss in a group their own lived experience helps them draw strength from each other. So there's something about the importance of the group that is very, very significant, I think, for our work. So I've mentioned the resilience, and different people want to talk about the actual trauma in very different degrees, different ways. Some people don't want to talk about it at all, and you have to work with that. So there are very individual differences, not just in the trauma and the damage of the trauma, the experience, but also how people want to recognize it. So, complex trauma tends to be more around the personal side. It tends to lead to more persistent, more extreme impacts rather than single traumas. Single trauma, you might get post-traumatic stress disorder. One incident can be terribly shocking, but it's one incident. that is rather different from the kind of complex trauma of people whose lives have been continuously messed up and messed around. It's very different from children who've been abused in childhood, say. That tends to lead more to the complex trauma rather than the PTSD. Trauma tends to build up. One trauma builds on another, and the defenses against feeling traumatized and feeling overwhelmed vary. And people will have a variety of coping strategies. I'm rushing through this very quickly now because I think most of Radek's presentation will give you a lot of the feel of that, particularly this bit. This is a very useful way of understanding the different ways in which trauma can affect people. And it helps you to start to realize just how different the expression of trauma can be. I believe one of my colleagues later this afternoon is going to focus a bit on this, so I won't say much about it. But from 2012, as I say, this is an evolving, rapidly evolving kind of understanding. You had people talking about the window of affective tolerance. Affective means of the emotions, yes? So there is a window during which people can tolerate the emotions that they are living with from their past and from their present. Outside of that range, if the trauma is such, or the length of trauma is such, that emotion, that manageable middle ground is lost, is blown away. Two very different ways to respond. On the one hand, hyper-arousal. This is panic, impulsive behavior, fight-flight, those very dramatic ways of responding, anger, agitation, or freezing up, but in a very visible way. That's one response to the fight-flight response that Radek was describing. But the other response that you will often see, very often see, hypo-arousal, numbness, submissiveness, desensitization, and a very poor self-care, poor boundaries, a very shut-down response. This is also understandable as a response, a defense against the trauma. Not a flight in the obvious external way, but a flight internally. This is just the beginnings, I think, of starting to understand and think through more carefully the kind of symptoms, the signs of trauma that you will often come across. I think it's useful to begin to understand. But of course it still opens up many different possible things that you need to think about. So, how then do we develop trauma-informed care based on these kinds? Oh no, hold on. Before we go on to that, no, I'll take it later. How do we develop a way of caring, of producing care services and care environments that are informed by this new understanding? Well, firstly, you begin with realizing the widespread impact, how much a part of our world trauma is, and how important, how central that understanding will need to be. You then want to look at the signs and symptoms, knowing the prevalence. You need to then understand the expression in this particular client, in this particular situation. And you want to respond in a way that uses that knowledge, that applies that knowledge in your context. And look at the policies, the procedures of your organization to say, now we know what we know, are the ways that we work helping us to help the person we are dealing with? So in 2010, Elizabeth Hoffer, Oliver Bazuk, came up with 4 key areas that they saw from the research that they were doing, going out and visiting homelessness services. Some of this works in schools as well, but in particular they produced a report called Shelter from the Storm. Shelter being the American word, I think is similar to the word that you use, a shelter, and Shelter from the Storm being a famous song by Bob Dylan. And the 4 key features that they identified in 2010 were awareness of trauma, awareness of the phenomenon of trauma and how that gets expressed in the signs and symptoms. An emphasis on making a place safe. And you can understand that when that fight-flight response is likely to kick in, either with hyper or hypo-arousal, safety, feeling okay where you are, is one of the first things that you will have to provide. You'll have to make sure your service gives that sense of safety. And you can understand the importance of that more clearly now. What they suggested was that the most creative of trauma-informed care services, recognizing the damage, were then working to find opportunities to create and make available opportunities to rebuild your life, rebuild your self-esteem, rebuild a new repertoire of responses to strengthen that middle ground. So the word opportunity is the crucial thing there, but it's opportunities to move on. And one of the bits of psychology, one of the schools of psychology that they suggested were most useful, because they were hearing that that's what people were finding worked, this was the psychology that worked for them, was what's called a strengths-based approach. Anybody familiar with that phrase? Is that known here? I don't see any hands going up. Okay. A strength-based approach comes from positive psychology, it comes from humanistic psychology, and it suggests that you need to focus on building someone's strengths rather than focusing on their weakness. Now that can sound quite paradoxical, sound quite contradictory. Usually therapy looks at the problem. But what they are suggesting is that those services that dwell on the problem aren't necessarily achieving the best results. If you dwell on what strengths that person has, what their capacity to recover is, with this population, in this situation, I'm not saying, in other words, that therapy based on identifying and understanding vulnerability and past history is bad. With some situations, it is what you need to do. But in these situations, with this client group, with this kind of care, it probably wasn't the most useful thing. It could be available if people themselves are ready for it, because that issue of personalized disclosure is very important, as we've seen. So what they found was that the services that work towards building on people's strengths and sometimes helping them to find some strengths to build on, their ambitions, their goals, the things they wanted out of life, that seemed to be the most effective way of working. So a strength-based approach, that's the psychological model that seemed to be most effective with the services that they would identify. And they went out and they researched and they talked to a lot of different homelessness services to identifying what was working. We'll see in a little while that this formulation from 2010 has developed. It's moved on in some ways. That was an early version in 2010. But you can understand, you can see how it works. You can see how this way of working makes sense of the need to engage people who've had complex trauma in their lives. And they also addressed the issue of how challenging, emotionally challenging it is for the workers. They talked about the need, if you realize that the work if you realize that the clients you're dealing with and the work you are doing is trying to engage people who have huge emotional turmoil, either up front or underneath, then that is going to be emotionally challenging for the workers. So it was the first, in the States, it was the first recognition that you need to support the workers if you're going to support the client, the service user. It was absolutely central to the whole idea right from the start. And you can see why when you realize the emotional package that there is in this work. Now here, in the presentation they gave, there's a beautiful video. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's some cartoons and some visual imagery, and it's how the ideas of trauma-informed care are being applied by the Public Health Service in Glasgow in Scotland. Now, the Glasgow accent is very, very strong. Many Scottish people cannot understand people from Glasgow. And I know this is being recorded, and I know that they will be listening to this bit where they know that it's true. So, although I think it's really, really good, in order to work as a public health document, they had to speak the language of people in the streets in Glasgow. So they were speaking the thickest, the most dense of Glasgow accents. I don't think it's going to be helpful for us to do this today. So, but you can see where you understand. So, these slides, as I say, were produced by Tasmin Maitland, who is the Innovation and Good Practice Manager of the Homeless Link Service, which is the central capacity building and sector representing body for homelessness in England. They don't cover Scotland. And you can find more about some of the stuff they've written on one of the pages on the website. And if you look, trauma-informed care and psychologically informed environments. So although even in their presentation about trauma-informed care, they are already saying, oh, and there's this other thing. They do mention it a little bit in the presentation, but I'm rushing that part. So it does show how, at least within the UK, where the PI idea first began, the two are seen as being so closely related. So let's now move on to look at how did that idea develop. I've given you some of the story up to about 2010 or 2012 or so when we produced the more detailed account. And it's what happened since then that I want to talk about. Well, one of the things that happened since then was that we heard about trauma-informed care. And so we started saying, oh, well, this is another way of describing the same thing. So, now, this is a famous stone for anthropologists and cultural historians. It's in the British Museum, so you may not know it. After I'd done these slides, I realized how culturally relative many of my jokes are. Does anybody know the Rosetta Stone? Great. I'm not completely on my own here then. When people began to realize that in ancient Babylon they had complex civilizations with writing, long before the Bible, they wanted to try and read to understand the writing. They had clay tablets and so on, but they couldn't read it. They couldn't understand it. Until, at one point, purely by chance, in the town of Rosetta, I think, an explorer found this tablet. And this has parts of the law code of, I believe, Hammurabi, one of the rulers of Babylon. And it's written in 3 different languages. The three, well, in the Czech Republic, you know what it's like to have different languages. I assume that the 3 languages were the majority languages of the area where this stela was produced. But the important thing is they're all describing the same legal code, the Code of Hammurabi. That realization that this was three ways to describe exactly the same thing helped us then to interpret, to read the language. And from this stone came 10. So if you think of pies and trauma-informed care as different ways to describe the same thing, that I think is quite a helpful way to begin. Another way is to say agriculture was developed in different parts of the earth. Rice in China, corn in Mesoamerica, potatoes in South America. All around the same time, we all started to discover this same thing. But it grew slightly differently. Agriculture developed in a slightly different way in each area. So that's another way to look at the differences between pies and trauma-informed care. And the main point is that all of this is evolving. This is another of my cultural references that may work for my generation. This is Moses, Charlton Heston's film from about 1950. I'm too old for this. Coming down, bringing the tablets of stone, because he's been often talking to God. What I'm describing here is not tablets of stone. This is something, despite the Rosetta reference, this is something about a dialogue. This is not a law laid down. This is about trying to find the words that help us work together to use these ideas in practice. We talk of a psychologically informed environment. Does this mean that you all need to be psychologists? No. The psychology that we are talking about is emotional intelligence. Actually, it can be very helpful to have psychologists. It can be very helpful to have the encouragement of neuroscience and other psychology that helps to explain and understand. But much of what I'm interested in and what I'm focusing on is encouraging and allowing people to use ordinary human empathy. And you can inform that empathy, you can speed up that empathy through some of those psychological understandings. But it's actually the relationships that we start with. That's the fundamental nature of humanity. Relationships is normal. It's not a specialism that some people have to tell you and explain about. The capacity to understand each other is the human capacity. We just need help to use it in this situation. When we started talking about pies, we used a model, which is quite similar in some ways to the trauma-informed care model. We said it was important to have a psychological understanding, to approach things through an understanding of how people's past has affected how they are and how they relate to you. You must focus on staff training and support, because we know that emotional charge means that you must train your staff to understand and support them to manage the emotional challenges. We were looking then mainly at hostels, what happens within the building. So you look at the built environment, you look to see to what extent that makes possible the kind of interactions that you want. You can look at things like the lighting, the colour, the carpets, the signs. Do all the signs say, we do not allow violence and spitting or insults or whatever? Because what that says is that they're expecting it. What that says is this is how we see you. So think about what messages you want the environment to convey. Are they helping you in creating that safe space, that welcoming, engaging space? We talked about evidence-generating practice. I'll skip over that because we now use a slightly different language, but the point is to learn from what's working, to learn by doing, to learn from practice. There's a lot of very interesting ideas you can get from other people, but the most valuable ideas are the ones that you come up with in practice, in yourself. Talk to other people, sure, but we learn together. And finally, the stress on managing relationships. The most important thing that you're doing here is working with and developing the relationship, without which people will struggle to change and to move on. We then, a couple of years ago, after a lot more discussions with more people, started to think in broader terms about what it is that services are doing. So this is very, very recent. This is only in the last year or two that we've started looking at this rather bigger picture. We talk now of psychological awareness rather than a psychological model, because some people thought you had to have a specialist, particular psychological model, CBT, or what. No, the point is to actually be psychologically aware. If you want to have a psychological model, a specific model, fine, but that's a specific version. We talk about training and support for all people involved, because we often have volunteers, we have peer workers, peer support workers. So staff training and support can be for the cooks and the cleaners, and not just for the frontline staff. So we now broaden that. We talk not just about the built environment, but the whole environment around a service. If you're an outreach worker, you have to look at how you use the spaces that you're in. But we use that phrase of opportunity, again, to say that we're about using space to create opportunities for constructive interactions. Evidence-generating practice is broadened out, this new formulation. I'm having to rush this, I know, but we are trying continuously to find a language that describes all the different aspects. And when we're looking at managing relationships, we were focusing particularly on three areas: the rules, the roles within an organization that create opportunities for people to grow into, and the subtler responsiveness. 3 R's is one of those words in English that doesn't properly work in Czech. It means reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's one of the words used in schools. It's a joke that doesn't translate. So within each of those areas that you can then specify more specific areas to focus on. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly, if you want to focus on particular aspects of the work, this breaks it into 3 areas. I'm going to have to rush this again. A year or two ago, the trauma-informed care organisations came up with a self-assessment program or process for assessing to what extent your service works on a trauma-informed care way. As you can see, there's about 8 pages, and it goes into, again, a lot of detail. And then you can rate your own service according to whether or not you strongly agree or mildly agree or disagree that this is how you're working. It's a self-assessment process. And it, in fact, uses slightly different language. In blue, you have trauma awareness, emphasis on safety. In brown, the language used for the self-assessment process is more focused on what can you actually say you do. It's more about assessing the service. And it uses 5 slightly different criteria. It just shows how these ideas are evolving. We have something similar for the PIES approach now, an assessment process called PISAS. Now, in theory, that means the PIES self-assessment and service specification approach. But in practice, we just wanted it to spell pizzazz, because pizzazz is a showbiz word that means flair, creativity, buzz. What we wanted to say was actually that that's what's really important in services, to encourage creativity, to encourage the momentum, the excitement that many are starting to feel about understanding the work we're doing and being more creative in the work we do. We now have actually the PISAS we now have as an online version as well as a software version, which I could explain probably more usefully tomorrow. But I want to quickly double back to the self-assessment process, because this is one of a number of tools that have been developed to help services work in a more trauma-informed care way, and to focus on the things that are most important. In your packs, you have a few things that I fished out because I thought that these might be particularly focused and particularly useful for you. I can't possibly attempt to put this in check, but can somebody tell me how to pronounce that? Because I really, really recommend this particular checklist of ways to try and understand problematic, challenging behaviour, and to interpret that behaviour not in a punitive, controlling, excluding kind of way, but to interpret it as an individual struggling and whose help you may need. I'm not going to try and read it out now, but I strongly recommend it. I think it was from that 2010 paper, and I think it's one of the most useful things. You also have another checklist produced by an architect, in fact, Jill Pable in Florida, that takes a similar approach and allows you to look at the building that you operate in and focuses on a lot of very specific areas that you may find helpful to look at. So again, two very detailed tools that take these very broad general ideas, that take the science, take how those ideas are informing practice, and then allows you to go into the details of what you might do. Compare that then with the PIES self-assessment process. And you see the PIES process is more open. It's more about discussion and dialogue. Which of these is most useful for you at this point of time, I leave you to decide. If you need to look at the specifics, then I think those trauma-informed care checklists are very, very useful. If what you need is to have a broader discussion about how you're doing, how you're getting on, what new ideas you might come up with, then I think the PIES formula, which is more broader and more open, may be more closer to where you're at. But it depends entirely. Every service will be different, and it depends entirely on where you have reached. So, as much as 2 minutes. I'm rushing to have only. So, what's the general message here? These ideas are still new. The science is still new. The application of the ideas in practice is still new. The best way to describe what is effective is emerging, is developing. We're still looking for the best ways to capture the most exciting practice. So there is a continuous dialogue between people like me who are trying to think, trying to find the big ideas, and people like you who are telling me what works in practice. Just this very morning, 5 minutes before the conference started, I had an email from some people in Bristol, where they have a part of the city centre that's become a very rough, run-down area. It's where the people go to drink beer or to smoke and play guitar, and all the shop owners are saying, this is terrible, we have to throw these people out, and the city council is trying to find a way to make this open public space feel more like a safe place for everybody, for the owners of the small businesses who are trying to sell sandwiches to their passing clients. And they've taken those 5 ideas from the PI model and adapted them, customized them with a language that works there. That was this morning. This is moving. This is continuously changing. And although we've been developing this for 10 years, the message I really would want to say is this will continue to evolve as you apply these ideas in this different context. We can translate these into Czech for you, but translating them into practice in your area, that's the next dialogue. You are coming into something which is evolving. It's not already fixed. We don't tell you what to do. We present you with ideas, and you draw from these ideas what's helpful, what's useful to you. And that's a good point to pause.